The sun was beginning to set on what had been a particularly demanding Friday at the federal courthouse. The judge had just wrapped up a complex case involving corporate fraud, his black judicial robe still draped over his arm as he walked through the marble-floored hallway toward the parking garage. Small details from the day's proceedings kept running through his mind: the nervous witnesses, the mountain of evidence, and the weight of having to make decisions that would impact so many lives. As he approached his car, he exchanged warm greetings with the courthouse security guard, a ritual they'd shared for over a decade. "Another late evening, Your Honor," the guard called out with a friendly smile. The judge nodded, managing a tired but genuine smile in return. "Justice never sleeps, right?" he replied, unlocking his black Mercedes sedan. The leather seat welcomed him as he settled in, finally allowing his shoulders to relax after hours of maintaining the proper judicial posture. He loosened his tie slightly and placed his briefcase, heavy with case files, on the passenger seat. The evening air was crisp, and through his open window, he could smell someone grilling in the distance, a reminder of the normal life that awaited him at home. As he drove, his thoughts drifted to the weekend ahead. His daughter had a piano recital tomorrow, and he promised to help his son practice for the upcoming basketball tryouts. These simple family moments were what kept him grounded, especially after days filled with weighty legal decisions. The streets of his neighborhood were quiet and familiar. He'd driven this route countless times over the years, watching the seasons change the colors of the trees that lined the well-maintained suburban streets. Children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns, and neighbors walked their dogs in the golden evening light. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made all the long hours at work worthwhile. He followed all the traffic rules meticulously. It was second nature to him after years of upholding the law. His Mercedes cruised smoothly at exactly the speed limit, and he came to complete stops at every stop sign, even though the streets were nearly empty. The car's GPS showed he was just 10 minutes from home, and he was already looking forward to changing into comfortable clothes and having dinner with his family. The neighborhood had changed over the 15 years he lived there. New families had moved in, bringing fresh energy to the community. He'd watched young trees grow tall and seen children who once rode tricycles now driving their own cars. As a judge, he took pride in being part of this community's fabric, someone neighbors would wave to and occasionally seek advice from during chance meetings at the local grocery store. His radio played soft jazz, the kind that helped ease the transition between work and home. He was just thinking about calling his wife to let her know he was on his way when he noticed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he assumed the police car would pass him. After all, he hadn't done anything wrong. But as the sirens chirped insistently, reality sank in. He was being pulled over. The judge's heart rate quickened slightly, not from guilt, but from an awareness that came from years of experience, both on and off the bench. He knew that even for someone in his position, these situations could be unpredictable. Following the protocol he knew by heart, he turned on his interior lights, kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Little did he know that this routine traffic stop was about to become a moment that would spark a national conversation about bias, power, and the complex relationship between law enforcement and the community they served. Through his rearview mirror, the judge watched as the police officer stepped out of the patrol car. The beam from the police spotlight made it hard to see clearly, but he could make out the officer's tense posture as he approached. Years of courtroom experience had taught the judge to read body language, and something about this officer's approach set off warning bells in his mind. "Good evening, officer," the judge said calmly, keeping his hands where they could be seen. The response he got wasn't what he expected. "License and registration," the officer demanded sharply, without any greeting in return. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, a detail that didn't escape the judge's notice. The judge spoke in measured tones, the same voice he used to maintain order in his courtroom. "Officer, I'd be happy to provide those. I'm reaching for my wallet now." He moved slowly, deliberately, years of shared community stories and experiences guiding his every motion. The leather wallet felt heavy in his hands as he carefully extracted his driver's license. "I'm also going to reach into my glove compartment for the registration," he continued, narrating his movements. The officer's flashlight beam followed his every move, harsh and bright in the growing darkness. As he handed over his credentials, he noticed the officer's eyes narrow at his federal judge identification card, which was visible alongside his license. "You expect me to believe you're a federal judge?" the officer scoffed, his tone dripping with skepticism. The judge felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach, one he hadn't experienced in years, not since taking his place on the federal bench. "Yes, officer. I've served on the federal court for 15 years. You can verify my credentials with dispatch." But the officer wasn't interested in verification. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, taking a step back and widening his stance. The judge knew this moment could go one of two ways. He could assert his authority as a federal judge more forcefully, or he could comply while maintaining his dignity. Years of wisdom guided his choice. "I'll step out of the vehicle," he said calmly, "but I want to note that you haven't told me why I was stopped." His hand moved to the door handle with deliberate slowness. The dark fabric of his suit caught the streetlight as he emerged from his car, standing tall but non-threatening. More patrol cars were arriving now, their lights painting the peaceful suburban street in alternating red and blue. Neighbors were beginning to peek out of their windows, some stepping onto their porches with phones in hand. The judge could hear the crackle of police radios and the soft murmur of gathering onlookers. The first officer maintained his aggressive stance, even as other officers approached the scene. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, though the judge's hands had never left sight. A small crowd was forming now, and phones were recording. The judge could hear the whispers of recognition from some neighbors who knew exactly who he was. Standing there on the street where he'd lived for over a decade, in front of the homes of people who waved to him every morning, the judge felt an odd sense of calm. This moment, though difficult, would have purpose. He'd seen countless cases from both sides of the bench, and he knew that what happened next would matter not just for him, but for his community. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge when another police car pulled up. This one was different. No flashing lights, just the quiet arrival of what would turn out to be a senior officer who was about to change the entire dynamic of this tense encounter. The judge stood perfectly still, his years of experience in the courtroom evident in his composed demeanor. He knew that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice was to let it fully reveal itself in the light of day. As the senior officer stepped out of his car, the scene was set for a dramatic shift that nobody on that quiet suburban street could have anticipated. The senior officer stepped out of his unmarked car, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. He walked with the confident stride of someone who had spent decades on the force, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. The moment he spotted the judge standing there in his suit, recognition flashed across his face. "Your Honor," the senior officer called out, his voice carrying across the now quiet street. The first officer's head snapped around, confusion evident in his posture. The senior officer quickened his pace, moving toward the scene with purpose. "I know this man," he announced firmly. "He's a federal judge. I've appeared in his courtroom dozens of times." The first officer's grip on his flashlight tightened, but uncertainty had replaced his previous aggression. The judge remained still, his dignified bearing unchanged despite the tension of the situation. The gathering crowd of neighbors had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment of this unexpected drama unfolding on their quiet street. "Officer," the senior officer addressed his subordinate. Why was the judge stopped? His tone was professional, but carried an edge of concern. The first officer stammered slightly. There was a report of suspicious activity in the area." The senior officer's expression hardened. And what was suspicious about a man in a suit driving home from work? The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. The judge finally spoke, his voice clear and measured, carrying the weight of his years on the bench. "I would like to know what prompted this stop as well. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I drive this route every day." Neighbors who had been watching began to step forward, several speaking up at once. "He's our neighbor," one called out. "We see him every morning," another added. The first officer's aggressive stance had completely deflated now, replaced by the dawning realization of his serious error in judgment. The senior officer turned to the judge, his face etched with genuine regret. "Your Honor, I apologize profusely for this situation. This is not how we train our officers to conduct themselves." He shot a meaningful look at the first officer, who was now standing awkwardly to the side, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. More neighbors had gathered, and the whispered conversations were growing louder. Many were sharing stories about the judge. How he'd helped coach youth basketball, how he always stopped to chat during his evening walks, how he'd been a pillar of the community for years. The contrast between these accounts and the way he'd just been treated was striking. The judge surveyed the scene thoughtfully. He saw the young officer's discomfort, the senior officer's embarrassment, and the community's outrage on his behalf. In that moment, he made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Instead of letting anger guide his response, he chose to turn this into a teaching moment. "I appreciate your apology," he addressed the senior officer, then turned to include everyone in his gaze. "But what concerns me isn't just how I was treated. It's the thought of how many other citizens might face similar situations without the benefit of my position to protect them." The street had fallen completely silent now, everyone hanging on his words. Even the young officer who had initiated the stop was listening intently, his earlier hostility replaced by what appeared to be genuine shame. The judge's words carried the weight of someone who had seen both sides of the justice system. The neighborhood had become an impromptu courtroom, with porch lights and street lamps serving as the only illumination. The red and blue patrol car lights still pulsed silently, creating an otherworldly atmosphere as the judge continued to speak. This moment, though unplanned, was becoming something more significant than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. The crowd of neighbors, the police officers, and even passing cars had all stopped to listen. Everyone present could sense that they were witnessing something important, a moment that would have repercussions far beyond this quiet suburban street. The night air was charged with the possibility of change, and the next few minutes would determine exactly what form that change would take. The tension in the air began to shift as the judge took control of the situation. With the same calm authority he used in his courtroom, he addressed the gathering crowd and the officers before him. His voice carried clearly through the evening air, turning this uncomfortable moment into something more meaningful. "What happened here tonight isn't just about me," he began, his words measured and thoughtful. "It's about our community, our trust in each other, and how we can do better." The young officer who had initiated the stop stood quietly, his earlier aggression replaced by visible discomfort as he listened. Neighbors had formed a loose circle around the scene, their phone cameras still recording, but many had lowered their devices, caught up in the judge's words. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged knowing looks. They'd all heard stories like this before, but seeing it happen to someone they knew and respected made it different. The senior officer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, would you be willing to file a formal report about this incident? We need to document what happened here." The judge considered this for a moment, looking around at the faces illuminated by the street lights and the still flashing police lights. "I will," he replied, "but not to punish. This needs to be documented so we can learn from it." He turned to the young officer who had stopped him. "Officer, I'd like to hear your perspective. What made you decide to pull me over tonight?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was an invitation to dialogue. The young officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but sensing the importance of the moment. "I received a call about suspicious activity in the area," he began, his voice less certain now. "But I realize now I acted on assumptions I shouldn't have made." A murmur went through the crowd. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman who had lived on the street even longer than the judge, spoke up. "We can't keep letting this happen," she said firmly. "We're better than this." Others voiced their agreement, but the judge raised his hand gently for silence. "Tonight can be different," he continued. "Instead of letting this incident divide us, let's use it to bring about real change." He looked directly at the young officer. "Would you be willing to be part of that change?" The officer met his gaze and, after a moment's hesitation, nodded. The senior officer was already on his radio, calling into headquarters. The situation had evolved beyond a simple traffic stop. It was becoming a catalyst for something larger. Neighbors were starting to talk among themselves, discussing ways to strengthen community police relationships and prevent similar incidents. A cool breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying with it the sounds of distant traffic and everyday life continuing beyond this moment. The judge's wife had arrived on the scene, having heard from concerned neighbors. She stood quietly supportive at his side, her presence adding another layer of humanity to the scene. The young officer's body camera was still recording, capturing everything. The judge knew this footage would be important, not as evidence for punishment, but as a teaching tool for other officers. His years on the bench had taught him that real change comes from understanding, not just enforcement. More residents were arriving, drawn by messages and calls from neighbors who had witnessed the initial confrontation. What had started as a tense and potentially dangerous situation was transforming into an impromptu community meeting. People were sharing their own experiences, listening to each other with new understanding. The night air had grown cooler, but nobody seemed eager to leave. This moment felt too important to rush. The judge's calm presence had turned what could have been an ugly incident into an opportunity for growth and change. As he looked around at the faces of his neighbors and the officers, he could see the beginnings of understanding dawning in their expressions. The next morning, news of what had happened spread quickly through the community. Local news vans lined the quiet suburban street where just hours before, an ordinary evening had turned into something extraordinary. The judge sat in his home office, watching as his phone lit up with messages of support and media requests. His wife brought him a cup of coffee, squeezing his shoulder gently. "How are you holding up?" she asked, knowing that despite his calm exterior, the previous night's events had affected him deeply. He took a thoughtful sip before answering. "I keep thinking about how this could make a real difference." Outside, neighbors were talking to reporters, sharing their accounts of what they'd witnessed. The story was different from similar incidents in one crucial way. It wasn't just about what went wrong, but about what happened next. The judge's response had transformed a potential flashpoint into a moment of community unity. The police department had already issued a statement announcing an internal review of their training procedures. The young officer who made the stop had requested a meeting with the judge through proper channels, showing a willingness to learn from his mistakes. The senior officer who had diffused the situation was now pushing for department-wide changes in community engagement protocols. As the judge prepared for his daughter's piano recital later that day, life had to go on. After all, he received a call from the police chief. "Your Honor," the chief began, "what happened last night was unacceptable. But your response, well, it's given us an opportunity we can't ignore." The chief explained that the body camera footage was already being used in discussions about reform. Officers watching it could see exactly how assumptions and bias had clouded judgment, and how a situation could be turned around through understanding and respect. Local community leaders began reaching out, suggesting town hall meetings where police officers and residents could have open discussions about their experiences. The judge's calm handling of the situation had shown that productive dialogue was possible, even in tense moments. The young officer's shift in attitude had been particularly striking. After the initial confrontation, he had stayed at the scene, listening to community members share their stories. By the end of the evening, he had been taking notes, asking questions, showing a genuine desire to understand different perspectives. The judge's phone buzzed with another message, this time from a fellow judge in a neighboring district. "What you did last night," the message read, "That's how real change happens. Would you be willing to speak to our judicial conference about it?" Looking out his office window, the judge could see children playing in the street again, neighbors chatting on their porches. The news vans were still there, but they weren't the story anymore. The real story was how a community was coming together, turning a moment of conflict into an opportunity for growth. His wife called from downstairs. It was time to leave for their daughter's recital. As he stood to go, he noticed something that made him pause. The young officer who had stopped him was on TV, speaking to a reporter. But instead of defending his actions, he was talking about learning and change. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have," the officer was saying. "But thanks to the judge's response, I'm learning to be a better officer." Walking downstairs, the judge reflected on how one moment could ripple out to affect so many lives. His phone was still buzzing with messages, but they could wait. Right now, he was just a father heading to his daughter's recital, grateful that last night's incident was becoming something more than just another sad headline. A week after the incident, the judge sat in his chambers, reviewing a stack of letters that had poured in from across the country. People from all walks of life had been touched by his story, but what caught his attention most were the messages from both police officers and community members, each sharing their own experiences and hopes for change. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a police academy trainer who had used the body camera footage in his classes. "Your response that night," he wrote, "has become a powerful teaching tool. It shows our cadets that there's always a choice in how we handle difficult situations." The young officer who had made the stop had undergone a remarkable transformation. Instead of becoming defensive or withdrawn, he had thrown himself into community outreach programs. Today, he was scheduled to speak at a local high school about his experience and what he had learned from it. Outside the courthouse, television crews were setting up for a press conference. The police department was announcing new training initiatives, developed with input from community leaders and legal experts. The judge had been asked to speak, but he knew his role now was to listen and support others stepping forward. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. Their son's basketball team had made it to the finals, and the game was this evening. Even as his story was making headlines, life's simple moments kept moving forward. These ordinary events felt more precious now, a reminder of what really mattered. A knock on his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. The senior officer who had helped defuse the situation that night entered, carrying a thick folder. "Your Honor," he began, "I wanted to show you something." Inside the folder were statistics about traffic stops in their district, along with a new proposed protocol for officer training. "We've been analyzing our patterns," the senior officer explained, spreading the papers across the desk. "What happened to you made us look harder at our own data. The numbers tell a story we can't ignore anymore." The judge listened as the officer detailed plans for comprehensive bias training and community engagement programs. Later that afternoon, during a break between cases, the judge received an unexpected visitor. It was one of his neighbors, an elderly man who had lived on their street for decades. "I've been watching our neighborhood change," the man said, settling into a chair. "What happened that night? It started conversations we should have had years ago." The neighbor shared how the incident had inspired local residents to organize regular community meetings with police officers. These weren't formal events, but casual gatherings where people could share stories and build real relationships. The first meeting had been held in someone's backyard, with homemade cookies and lemonade. The judge thought about how a single moment could create such ripples of change. The body camera footage had now been seen by police departments across the state, not as an example of what went wrong, but as a lesson in how to make things right. The young officer's transformation had become part of the story too, proof that change was possible when people were willing to learn and grow. As the day wound down, the judge prepared to leave for his son's basketball game. Walking through the courthouse parking lot, he passed the spot where news vans had gathered that first morning after the incident. Now it was quiet, but the work continued. Real change, he had learned, happened in the quiet moments after the cameras left. His phone buzzed one more time. A message from the police chief. The department's new training program was ready to launch, and they wanted the judge to review it. But that could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was about watching his son play basketball, about being present for the simple joys that made life worth living. 1 month had passed since that fateful night, and the changes it sparked were taking root in unexpected ways. The judge sat in a packed community center, watching as people filed in for the first official town hall meeting. The crowd was diverse: police officers in uniform and plain clothes, families, teachers, business owners, and community leaders. The young officer who had stopped him was now standing at the podium, his nervousness visible but his voice steady. "A month ago, I made a mistake that could have ended very differently," he began. The room fell silent, everyone leaning in to listen. "That night changed how I see my job, my community, and myself." From his seat in the middle of the room, the judge observed the faces around him. Some showed concern, others hope, but all were engaged. The officer continued sharing his story, no longer defending his actions, but explaining how they led to his own transformation. His honesty touched something in the room, and you could feel the mood shift. A local high school teacher raised her hand during the discussion. She shared how her students had been following the story, and how it had sparked deep conversations in her classroom about justice, respect, and the power of second chances. "My students see hope in this story," she explained, "because it shows that change is possible." The police chief took the stage next, unveiling new department policies that had been developed with community input. Body cameras would now be reviewed regularly for training purposes, not just when complaints were filed. Officers would spend time each month in community service, getting to know the neighborhoods they patrolled. Outside the community center, food trucks had set up in the parking lot. The organizers had intentionally made this feel less like a formal meeting and more like a neighborhood gathering. As people filed out for a break, they naturally mixed and mingled, sharing plates of food and casual conversation. The judge found himself in conversation with a group of rookie officers who had just graduated from the academy. They told him how the story had become part of their training, but more importantly, how it had changed their perspective on what it meant to serve their community. "We want to be part of the solution," one young officer said earnestly. Local business owners had stepped up too. The coffee shop on the corner was hosting weekly coffee with a cop meetings where residents could chat with officers in a relaxed setting. The neighborhood hardware store had donated supplies for a community garden project where officers and residents worked side by side. A local filmmaker had been documenting these changes, capturing the small moments that showed real progress. Her camera caught children high-fiving officers at the local playground, elderly residents sharing stories at community meetings, and teenagers participating in youth police dialogue sessions. The judge's wife, who had been quietly supporting these initiatives, touched his arm. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to where the young officer who had stopped him was now deep in conversation with a group of community elders, taking notes and asking questions about their experiences. The evening news crews were still interested in the story, but now they were covering something different. How one incident had sparked a movement of positive change. They interviewed shop owners who reported better relationships with local police, teachers who saw more trust building among their students, and officers who felt more connected to their community. As the town hall meeting resumed, the judge noticed something remarkable. The questions from the audience weren't about blame or past mistakes anymore. Instead, people wanted to know how they could get involved, what more they could do to help build bridges in their community. 3 months after the incident, the changes that began in one suburban neighborhood had spread far beyond its borders. The judge walked into a statewide law enforcement conference, where he'd been invited as the keynote speaker. The audience wasn't just police officers. There were community leaders, politicians, and citizens from across the state. The conference hall buzzed with energy. People shared stories of how they'd implemented similar programs in their own communities. A police chief from a neighboring city described how they'd revamped their entire training program. "We watched what happened in your community," he said to the judge, and realized we needed to do better. During a break, the young officer who had stopped the judge that night was surrounded by other officers. He wasn't just telling his story anymore. He was now training others, sharing what he'd learned about checking biases and building community trust. The shame that once clouded his face had been replaced by purpose. At the back of the room, a wall displayed photographs from various community initiatives that had sprung up. Kids playing basketball with officers, community gardens being planted, neighborhood watch meetings that looked more like family gatherings. Each image told a story of barriers being broken down and trust being built up. The judge's presentation wasn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. Instead, he shared what he'd learned about the power of turning difficult moments into opportunities for growth. That night could have ended with anger and division, he told the crowd. Instead, it became a beginning. During the question and answer session, a retired officer stood up. His voice shook with emotion as he described how this story had changed his perspective on his own career. "I wish I'd learned these lessons 30 years ago," he said. "But it's never too late to make things right." Local businesses had caught the spirit of change too. The Chamber of Commerce announced a new program where shop owners would mentor at-risk youth, with police officers serving as program advisors. The idea was simple. When people knew each other as individuals, stereotypes began to fade. Back in his community, the changes were even more visible. The police department's new training center had a community room where residents could drop in any time. Officers held regular sports events with local kids, and a monthly newsletter highlighted positive interactions between police and residents. The judge received an email from a police academy instructor in another state. They had created an entire curriculum around what had happened that night, using it to teach future officers about the importance of checking their assumptions and treating everyone with respect. A group of high school students had started a podcast about community police relations, interviewing both officers and residents about their experiences. Their young voices brought fresh perspective to old problems, and their enthusiasm for positive change was contagious. The young officer who made the stop that night had been promoted to a new position, Community Relations Coordinator. He'd earned it not because of the incident, but because of how he'd grown from it. His office walls were covered with thank you notes from community members he'd helped. As the conference drew to a close, people lingered, exchanging contact information and making plans to visit each other's communities. What had started as one tense moment on a quiet suburban street had grown into a movement for positive change that showed no signs of slowing down. 1 year later, the judge stood in his backyard, hosting a neighborhood barbecue that had become a monthly tradition. Police officers mingled with residents, children played on the lawn, and the atmosphere was filled with the kind of easy comfort that only comes from true community bonds. The young officer who had stopped him that night was there too, now a respected figure in the community. He was showing a group of kids his patrol car, but this time it wasn't about authority. It was about connection. The children's laughter mixed with the sizzle of the grill and the murmur of friendly conversations. A local news crew had come to do a story about the 1-year anniversary of the incident. The reporter seemed surprised by the scene. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted to the judge. "I thought I was covering a story about conflict, but this is about something else entirely." The police chief arrived with fresh statistics that told a powerful story. Traffic stops were down, but community trust was up. Crime rates had decreased, not through aggressive policing, but through better understanding between officers and residents. The numbers proved what everyone could feel. Real change was possible. An elderly neighbor approached the judge, tears in her eyes. "I've lived here for 50 years, she said, "and I've never felt safer or more connected to our police officers." She gestured to where her grandson was playing catch with an officer who regularly patrolled their street. The young officer's transformation had become a symbol of hope. He'd been invited to speak at police academies across the country, sharing his story with new recruits. "I thought being a good officer meant being tough," he often told them. "Now I know it's about being human first." The community center that hosted that first town hall meeting had become a hub of activity. Youth programs, senior citizen meetings, and police community gatherings filled its calendar. The walls were covered with photos showing a year of progress, faces of all ages and backgrounds coming together. Local schools had developed a new curriculum about community relations, and police officers regularly visited classrooms not as authority figures, but as neighbors and mentors. Students who once felt nervous around police now saw them as allies in building a better community. The judge's wife had started a foundation to help other communities implement similar programs. They'd received requests from cities across the country, each hoping to create the same kind of positive change. The story had become bigger than one incident, bigger than one community. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, the judge watched a scene that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Officers and residents sat together at picnic tables, sharing stories and laughing. Children played freely, moving between groups of adults with complete trust. The final report from the police department's year-long study had been released that morning. It showed that other precincts adopting their new approach had seen similar positive results. What started as one tense moment had grown into a model for change that actually worked. Looking around his backyard, the judge realized that the true legacy of that night wasn't in the policies changed or the programs created. It was in the simple sight of people who once viewed each other with suspicion, now sharing a meal as friends and neighbors. The real victory wasn't in proving who was right or wrong. It was in showing that change was possible when people chose to learn and grow together.